communications is the forcing function for strategy. And you want to make sure that your audiences understand that strategy and that you can reach those corporate goals that you have set.
Hi, I'm Ed Marsh, host of the Industrial Growth Institute podcast. My goal with this podcast is to have a fascinating guest and conversation with each episode, but also to hit on themes and a high-level trajectory that puts every episode in the context of a much bigger industrial revenue growth topic. One of the things that happens is that means that often we're learning from folks who have deep expertise in functional and strategic areas outside of industrial marketing and talking about how we can apply those lessons to the world that we live in. And today is one of those cases. I'm really excited to welcome Trista Morrison. Trista is a seasoned, I'll tell you, that's her word, that's not mine, bio-pharmaceutical executive advisor and cross-functional strategist with more than 20 years of experience in corporate affairs and stakeholder management. That means investors, media, employees, patients, etc., for public companies. She's held multiple chief-level roles, reporting to the CEO, and her work has included a long list, including board of directors, management facilitation, strategy, looking at corporate goals, long-term planning, strategic vision, corporate narrative, investor relations, corporate communications, employee communications, culture and engagement, DEI, corporate social responsibility and ESG, and patient advocacy. She's worked on company launches, financings, partnerships, data readouts, FDA approvals, product launches, restructuring, shareholder activism, and issue management. I know her through our common activity around independent director certifications and roles. We're both members of the National Association of Corporate Directors and hold NACD's directorship certification. So I know that today we're going to zoom into specifics and tactics of communications, and we're going to zoom out to strategy and boards and probably back and forth. So I'd say buckle up, I guess, no matter where you are with your perspective as a listener. We're going to tie a lot together today. And as we get started, of course, I'd ask you to think about giving the podcast a 5-star review, share the episodes with folks who might appreciate them, comment on them, and add your perspective in comments. So let's jump in with that. Welcome, Trista.
Wow, thank you so much for having me today, Ed. That was quite an introduction.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you, and a great bio and really interesting intro, but I got to say a bit of corporate speak in there. I guess that comes from corporate communications. So tell us in more detail. Let's start with kind of what makes Trista tick.
What makes Trista tick? You know, I think I've always considered myself to be a storyteller. So that's probably the red thread that I could pull through my entire career. I love thinking about where a company is today, where a company wants to go in the future, and how we're going to get there. And then helping your audiences, whether those audiences are investors or whether they're customers, whether they're employees, prospective employees, current employees, right? Helping your audiences understand what that journey looks like so that they can follow along with it and everyone can be rowing in the same direction.
And I know we're going to pull on that red thread more as we talk today. You didn't mention, though, a lot about your nonprofit work or even being a merit badge counselor for Scouting America. Those are interesting angles. How did you get into those? And give us more of that background.
Sure. So let's see. So I have been a merit badge counselor for a number of years because I have 2 boys who are both in Scouts. And so I think it's a great organization. I think it's one of the few organizations that really focuses on sort of life skills and like how to be a functioning member of a community that, you know, adds value and like they have to learn about how to be a good citizen, right? And what are the rights and responsibilities of citizenship and just interesting, I think, things that don't get a lot of focus today. So that nonprofit definitely has, I think, an important place in how I prioritize my time. In addition to that, I work with the Tremere Foundation, which is a nonprofit that is focused on mentoring the next generation of leaders in the biotech industry. So I've worked with them for a number of years, really enjoyed that as well. And then, happy to happy to do guest lectures at universities. I've been doing some of that lately, and just always interested in more opportunities to talk about communications and help other folks to better understand it and get excited about it.
And I know as I've researched you and talked to you and listened to you, what folks are going to get today is a masterclass from the tactical through the strategic. And I know when you offer guest lectures, I'm sure they're tremendously impactful for people. But how old are your sons? And are they on track? Is it important for them to hit Eagle Scout? Is that an aspiration, or is it just kind of an activity that mom's asking them to do along the way?
So no, they're 13 and 16, and I am not pushing them to be Eagle. My 16-year-old has already decided that's not his path. He is most interested in the leadership aspects of Scouts, and so my younger one, will see.
Got it. And I think you've certainly worked with international companies. Have you worked as an expat as well, or have you been in the U.S. all the time working internationally?
I have always been based in the US. I have worked for 2 international companies. One was headquartered in Sweden. The other was headquartered in Denmark. Both were publicly listed on the Swedish NASDAQ. And so I have had some experience there and have had the wonderful opportunity to travel back and forth a bit in those roles, although one of them overlapped with the pandemic, so not as much travel as I might have hoped. But I do think that being an expat would be a great experience, so perhaps something for the future.
And how about that international angle? Has that infused your understanding of communications in ways with kind of cultural differences and stuff that you think brings an additional perspective to it?
Absolutely. And that's why I took the first role with an international company, because I wanted to get that experience, and this company had operations in 70 countries around the world, and I wanted to be able to have that exposure to different cultures and different ways of communicating.
I remember we're both located near Boston now, and so you'll recognize Logan Airport when I mention it. I remember one time on a flight from, I think, through Houston, from Sao Paulo back to Logan, sitting next to somebody on the second leg of the flight from Brazil who worked in marketing for the largest Brazilian beer brand, who was coming to Boston because the largest Brazilian expat community outside of Japan is actually in the Boston area. And they didn't have anybody here in American marketing consultants and agencies who could bring the cultural insight necessary to really speak and provide the right messaging for beer for that community here. So cultural stuff is fascinating about how it impacts communications.
Absolutely.
Now, I know that you're in biopharmaceutical now, and you've got a long background in biology. In fact, I think when you went to Tulane, you studied cell and molecular biology and combined that with marketing, which strikes me as an unusual combination. How did you stumble into that?
That was just pure serendipity. That turned out to be an excellent fit for my entire career, and I did not plan it that way. I wish I could have said that I did, but I was, I think like many folks, I was starting out pre-med, and hence the cell and molecular biology focus. And then, about halfway through, kind of realized that I probably did not want to pursue that path anymore and did not see myself going to med school. But I was so far along in that major that it made sense to finish it. And so I thought, what am I going to do with an undergraduate degree in cell and molecular biology if I don't go to med school? And I thought, well, I'll pick up a marketing degree from the business school because that should be marketable. And I went from there.
And obviously built quite an impressive career on it. It's fascinating how people have these serendipitous experiences that shape their career, and often in really inspiring sorts of ways.
Yeah.
Now, I know you speak often about high-level strategy and communications, but you see it from 2 perspectives. You've rolled up your sleeves and worked tactically. You also work with boards from a very high-level strategic perspective. And I heard you use in conversation with me and listening to you chatting with others an expression that I think is fascinating, and that is that communications is a forcing function for strategy. Unwind that for us.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think oftentimes it's not until you get asked the question that you have to really think about not just how you communicate the answer, but what is the answer, right? For an example, in the drug industry, right? Sometimes it might not be until someone says to you, what is your approach? What's your philosophy on compassionate use, that you sit around a table and look at each other and say, what is our strategy on that? What is our approach to that, right? So that's what I mean by, so often communications becomes the forcing function for strategy. You realize that you need to make a statement about a topic. And if you're struggling to make that statement, oftentimes it's because you're not sure what the answer is, right? Like the strategy behind it isn't tight and hasn't been worked out all the way, or perhaps just needs to be evolved to fit the way the company has evolved over time. I think that's one of the fascinating things about doing communications in a company, is that it's never done, right? You never can say, okay, we're done with this, because companies are always evolving and growing, and they're merging, they're acquiring an asset, something fails, something else succeeds, they enter a new market, right? The company is always shifting and changing, and so the communications and the corporate narrative has to keep up.
And the markets they sell to are changing often, and their buyers' markets are changing. I think this is a really important point for industrial manufacturers who maybe traditionally kind of look at their strategy as the last 10 years with some linear extrapolation into the future, often built around perhaps relatively minor evolution of features on their product roadmap, rather than stepping back and saying, okay, the world in which our buyers live is radically different than it was 5 years ago. Does that mean we radically re-engineer the company? No, not necessarily. But we need to think about it that way. And I love the idea of, if we back up and look at communications, as I think we're going to talk more about storytelling, as you get ready to tell those stories, you're not telling the story about the, foot-pounds of torque that your machine makes. You're talking about how it impacts other people's businesses. This is, I think, a fascinating point. I'm so glad that I heard you talk about it, and we're going to be able to dig into that more.
Yeah, absolutely, Ed. I mean, I think what you're getting to there is the so what, right?
Exactly. Right.
It's so important, and I think sometimes when you're communicating in a highly technical industry, and I would imagine that's true both of the biotech industry that I work in and the industry that you work in, it can sometimes be easy to get. You are very knowledgeable and you are very focused in all of the specifications of what your product provides, right? And so like you said, you want to talk about torque, you want to talk about all these things, and it's important. Even when you're talking to other experts, it's important to also remember to lift up and talk about, why does this matter?
Right.
And that's what we call in communications the so what.
Right. Yeah, obviously, when you're talking to a parent of a child with a rare disease, they don't care about the molecule. They care about their kid being around in Christmas in 5 years, and a very different kind of communication. That's so what is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, many industrial companies, in my experience, even those really in the upper middle market, say $1 billion, they don't really have a clear understanding of the role of content always. And I'm struck that your combination of marketing study and your clarity on the strategy piece probably leads to a much bigger communications topic today than, marketing or content. But I'm ignorant, and I'll say that up front. So we need to kind of start at a high level. And my apologies for anybody that's going to be bored as we go through this part of it. But if we have strategy, communications, and marketing circles, visualize them on a Venn diagram, how do they relate? Are they all overlapped, or is there a small intersection? How do they fit together?
So that's a great question. I think there is a Venn diagram, and there is some overlap. I think there has become more overlap over time, right? And it depends on what part of communications you're talking about, right?
Okay.
Because oftentimes there's corporate communications and product communications.
Okay.
So if you think about that, corporate communications is how you talk about your company's reputation, your company's plans, right? This type of communications is really important to investors. It's really important to employees, because these are audiences who want to know where are you going to be in 5 years? Because that's very tied to where they're going to be in 5 years, whether they're investing in you or working for you or thinking about taking a job with you, right? So that's where corporate communications is very important. And then there's product communications, right? And so that's when, of course, you're focusing more on the product. And I would say that's where you're going to have a lot more of an overlap with the marketing team. Now, a lot of the difference in my mind, and I'm not a marketing expert, I'm a communications expert. So, but I'll say my understanding of marketing is it's a lot more advertising, pay for play, right? Like what can we buy to get our message out there, whether that's, ads on a website or in a magazine. And when you think about communications, there's something that we use called the PESO model, and that stands for paid, earned, shared, and owned, right? Okay. So those are kind of 4 verticals that you can think about. So like I said, there is paid, and that overlaps quite a bit, I think, with advertising, but you could envision paid as being like an advertorial, right? So it's not an advertisement, but it's content that you're creating and you're paying to place it somewhere, right? Another example would be like, let's say you're partnering with a publication because they're going to write some editorial content, but you also want then like a graphic or something on the back page. There's various ways that you can do paid. And then earned is when you are trying to get reporters to tell your story, right? Reporters, podcasters, influencers, people like that. You're essentially pitching a story. You're not paying them. You're just on the value of the so what, right? The value of why it matters. You're trying to get them interested in being ambassadors and telling your story, helping get your story out there. Shared is sort of one step deeper. Some people use the S to say social because it is often used in that context. But shared is more when you're co-creating with those influencers and other audiences. So maybe you're thinking together about how you could tell a story for the brand, and you're not just giving them an idea, but you're helping them to actually co-create content. And then owned are the channels that you have complete control over, like your website, maybe a blog, maybe a podcast that you run, things like that.
So is it fair that corporate communications may be kind of close to what folks in the industrial space think of as branding?
Branding for your company, yes.
Right.
And then there's branding for your product, right?
Sure.
So I think it could go both ways. But yes, corporate communications is very much what is your company's brand.
Got it. Okay. I heard you on a recent episode of the Frictionless Marketing Podcast, obviously a deep dive into the biotechnology world. And that may not be the right term. That's, as an outsider, that's what it sounds like to me. One of the things that you talked about was a distinction you drew, and the host of that podcast drew, between story making and storytelling. And that was a really interesting distinction for me. Talk us through the difference between the two, and why is story making important?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I said earlier that I've always kind of considered myself to be a storyteller, and that's sort of been the way I've described the constant, that red thread in my career, until I read the book that was written by this podcast host of the Frictionless Marketing Podcast, and it's called Frictionless Marketing, and they talk about story making. And I think that in my mind, story making ties even more closely to strategy, right? It's sort of like in the bio-pharmaceutical world, you could imagine, a company saying, we would like to look more patient-centric. We would like you to tell some stories about us that make us look patient-centric. And the answer would be, well, what are you doing that's patient-centric, right? How are you actually doing that work? Do you have a standing patient advisory board that's advising you on your strategies and, reviewing your clinical trial protocols? And like what are you doing that's patient-centric? And then we can talk about that.
Right.
Right. And so I loved I had never heard that term before, but I loved it. And as soon as I heard it, I was like, I'm not a storyteller. I want to be a story maker. I want to do the work.
Right, right. Of course, many of the kinds of companies that I chat with that are listening to this tend to be very focused on what they make as opposed to the outcomes that it produces for their buyers. So it feels like this story making is a really important point. What do you think, in your experience, understanding it's a different industry, but what do executive teams typically misunderstand about storytelling, much less, I guess, story making?
I think it really does all come back to the intersection with strategy, right? I think a lot of times an executive team, let's say like a CEO, will say, I hate our website, right? Like, I don't think our website, it doesn't convey who we are. Well, my first question would be, well, who are you? Right. And that kind of gets back to what we were talking about like, are you really clear on that? Do you really understand, like, what are your companies? What is your vision? What is your mission? What is your 3-year strategy? And what is your 1-year, what 1-year goals do you have to achieve to keep you on the path for that 3-year strategy? If you can't necessarily answer those questions as a CEO or as a small business owner, then it's going to be very hard for you to have a website that helps communicate to others what it is you're trying to do and why it matters and where you're going, right? It's really important to be able to bring people along on that journey. And so you have to know it, right? You have to sit down and do that work and ask yourself, what is my vision for this company? Where do I want this company to be in, 3 years, 5 years? And then you can think about how you slowly bring people along on that journey. You don't necessarily want to get out over your ski tips, right? You don't want to start, promising or setting up things that are too far in the future that you don't have any sort of evidence that you can achieve yet. But it's good that people should understand directionally where you're going, right? You want to bring them along on that journey.
And you make the point, of course, that it's not just where you're going, but why it's important, why it matters, what the why is. Part of your background is helping facilitate board discussions of this kind of topic. What do you find is the best way? Should executive management bring it to the board and then board massage it? Should the board work on it with executive management? How have you seen the best strategies most consistently created?
So I would say that the creation of strategy lives with the company, right? With the executive team, and it's got to involve the CEO, right? Because it's really central that person has that the strategy represents their vision and where they're going, right? But it is, as we know from working with NACD, with the National Association of Corporate Directors, it is very important that the board review and approve strategy. So I think that's, and I think what the board can often do is ask the right questions.
Of course.
And they have, the wonderful phrase that NACD so often uses, which is noses in, fingers out. Right. Which is this concept that your board should have their nose in. They should be asking the right questions and monitoring, but they should have their fingers out. They should not be doing the work. That's the job of the executive team. And I think that's such a great description and easy way to understand the difference.
All right, but let me pick on that for a second and let's use communications as an example, because if the board has no significant contemporary communications experience represented in its skills matrix, nobody on the board has that background, then can the board know what they don't know to ask those questions to tease out whether strategy and communications are being used together, or are they just flying blind and ignorant of the fact that they've got that gap?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I think it probably depends on where a company is in their journey. Okay. Right. So there are going to be, because, and this kind of comes again back to strategy, right? When you think about communications, it all starts with your corporate strategy. What are you trying to achieve as a company? And then you can think about how does communications support that? How can communications help me reach my target audiences in the places where they are with the messages that I want them to receive, right? And so I think there are certain times in a company's lifestyle where, or life cycle, where maybe that is, it's in a good place, it's solid, it's, continuing. And then there are certain times in a company's life cycle, right? It may be that the market has changed and the company needs to change with it. It may be that there's a new competitor in the market and the company needs to figure out how they're differentiated from that competitor. It may be that there is a strategic shift happening within the company, that the company has decided to, go into a different segment or a different area, or that there's a management shift, that there's a new leader coming into the company who needs to begin to put their shape on their stamp on the strategy. I mean, as you can imagine, there could be a lot of reasons where suddenly that communications and that intersection between communications and strategy is really important. And I think during those times, it would certainly benefit the board to have some expertise in that area so that they can know to ask the right questions, right? And if they don't have someone with that expertise, it might be a good idea for them to consider bringing in someone, right? Bringing in either a board member or even an external consultant who could help them through that period of time.
It feels, though, like storytelling is becoming such an important part of the way we live. I mean, we all have B2C experiences that really seem to now shape our expectations for B2B experiences. And being part of a story, understanding that story feels like an important part of it. So I'd say here's your opportunity to pitch why every board ought to consider having somebody like yourself on it. And then we'll provide information at the end where people can get in touch with you if the light bulb goes on for them.
Yeah, absolutely. You're very kind, Ed. Thank you for thinking about it that way. I mean, I really think, like I said, I really think it depends on the company's strategy, but there are so many examples that I can think of, and we just talked about a couple of them. It could be getting ready to launch a new product, getting ready to enter a new segment. I mean, there's so many different concepts, and honestly, even when you think internally, right? Like, how do your own employees get the information that they need to be successful and to do their jobs? How are you helping them to make the right decisions in their day-to-day work, right? You
mean putting the vision on a poster on the wall of the cafeteria doesn't do enough?
I don't think so. I think what really helps is when you can bring that vision to life for them, right? So I think they want to hear it from the CEO's own mouth. They want to see examples of what it looks like in action. I think those things can really help to pull it through, because ultimately, right, what you want is you want your employees to like, if they're having to make a decision between, A and B in their daily job, and they need to make that decision, there's not time to up level it or whatever. You want them to understand which is the way that you would want them to go, right? And that's what, in my mind, your vision, your mission, your core values of your company and your strategy help give them, is the tools and the information that they need to make sure that they keep just moving down the right path, and that we're all, as we say, rowing in the same direction.
I think that boils it all down. Do they have the information they need when they have to choose between two possible decisions, and they can't involve everyone around them and leave the responsibility for the decision up to somebody else? Do they have the information they need in order to make the right decision on behalf of the company? That feels to me like a great description of internal communications.
Yeah. And do they know why it matters? Right. I mean, I think the so what is really important to employee engagement. Right. And so that is one thing that, working in the pharmaceutical industry, it's sort of built in, right? We all know why we're getting out of bed every morning. We know that we are trying to develop a drug that is going to save lives or make people's lives enormously improved in a game-changing way, right? Or help the caregivers around them. And so that so what is pretty built in when you work in the pharmaceutical industry. Now in your industry, I think it's probably more important to help people understand, right? If they're working in a factory, do they understand the final product that's coming out of that factory and how it is impacting, the ability to feed our nation, the ability to do so in a sustainable way, right? Whatever it is, the ability for people to care for their pets who are family members, right? Whatever it is that you're churning out, like, don't underestimate the power of even if people know it, right? Even if you're like, well, everybody knows that, it's obvious. But don't underestimate the power of those stories of how it has actually impacted people in the real world and why it matters.
And understand that you can help make those stories. I mean, that's such a great distinction.
Absolutely. Right. And that's a great opportunity in communications. If you get, customer feedback, positive customer feedback, sharing that with your employees, helping them to understand how something that they did really made a difference.
Right. Now, you've mentioned different types of communications, and you've also mentioned different audiences. So you've mentioned strategic and corporate and internal and product, and you've alluded to PR and crisis management. I'm sure there are others. And then in terms of audiences, you've talked about investors and end users and employees. So take us through kind of, again, for those of us that don't have your background in communications, what are the types and what are the audiences that everyone ought to be thinking about?
Well, again, so I think, communications it's so broad. And like you said, there are so many audiences, right? And so many different ways to approach those audiences. I will say that one thing that I think is really important to remember is that in today's interconnected world, you have to assume that all audiences are always listening. So it is very important to prioritize your audiences, right? Because the audience that's your top priority is going to change as your business needs change, right? There may be a time when potential employees are your top priority because you are going through a hiring push and you need to hire X many people in this amount of time. And so at that point in time, the potential employees out there in the world, that's your top priority audience. There may be another time when investors are your top priority audience because you're getting ready to do a financing, right? Or you need to diversify your investor base or improve your relationship with your investors, whatever that may be. And then, there may be another time when various customer segments may be your primary audience. So that's going to shift over time. And it's always important to, again, be looking at like, what are we trying to get done as a business and what audiences do we need to reach to get that done, right? So you definitely have to prioritize. Nobody has the time or the resources to try to do everything all at once, but it is important to remember that everyone is listening, right? And so the distinction that I would make there in, like, let's use again the pharmaceutical industry as an example, because that's one that I live in and know well, is that you may be having a conference call for investors to talk about your quarterly earnings, but you better believe that somebody from the FDA is listening, right? You better believe that a patient or a patient's family member is listening. So that may not be your primary target audience for that call, but be aware and don't say something you're going to regret because those other audiences are also listening, right? So you just always need to kind of think about that holistically.
But how do you avoid that becoming paralyzing? I mean, you try to cover every eventuality and make sure that you don't say anything offensive to anybody. At some point, you just don't say anything, right?
No, that's not. See, this is what I love about communications. There's always an answer. You just have to find it, right? There's always an answer. I think, and honestly, I think a lot of times it just comes down to being respectful, right? Being respectful of your audiences and everyone who's listening. I mean, like, I will say that, at one point in my career, I will not say when or where, I worked with a marketing guy who liked to talk about markets as, low-hanging fruit, right? Like this market is the low hanging fruit. We're going to go there first, right? And I would have to remind him, these are people who have a disease. Let's not call them low hanging fruit.
Right.
Nobody wants to hear that, right? Like no one wants to hear themselves talked about that way. And I know you don't really feel that in your heart. It's just sort of like industry insider marketing speak,
Right,
but let's
right.
not use that, right? So I think it's really just more about being aware and being respectful and just thinking twice before using jargon or things like that. But it doesn't have to be paralyzing.
Makes sense. From my perspective, it feels like communications is a lot about content, different kinds of content produced for different audiences. But I know that you bring really impressive editorial chops to your work as well. You come from a very strong content creation background, having managed a weekly biotechnology trade newspaper, and you wrote for a daily newsletter. What has the deadline world of content creation taught you about communications?
I would say that being a reporter for a daily newspaper taught me there is no such thing as writer's block. You just get it done.
Right.
Which is good. It's good to have that forcing function. I think sometimes when folks are trying to create content and they are faced with a blank page, it can feel overwhelming. And sometimes a good exercise can be to just set a timer, right? Set a timer for 30 minutes and just say, I'm going to just get whatever I can down on this page. It doesn't matter if it's good. It doesn't matter if it's crap. I can throw the whole thing away later if I want to, but like just get something down.
Right.
Sometimes that can help you move
That can help
forward.
prime the pump.
Yeah. And a lot of times you'll be surprised. You know, you may actually like some of what you wrote down.
Right. Now, obviously, as a journalist, you mentioned earlier about pitching to get your leadership or your subject matter experts in front of journalists as a resource for earned media. You've been on the other side of it. Talk a little bit about using communications to position the company and its leaders or those subject matter experts as industry experts. What's the best way to do that with journalists? I assume it's not just hitting them every week with an email, hey, you want to talk to our people? There's got to be a lot more to it, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important to think about where are you trying to get in front of, right? Like what publications do you want to get into, or what podcasts do you want to get on, or what, social influencers are you trying to get to mention you, right? And then understand their work, right? Read their work, listen to their episodes, read their feed, understand like what is the type of stuff that they write about. And then you think about, how could I fit into a story that fits into what the types of things are that they're interested in, right? And so I will say, like in this day and age, there's just not that many outlets out there who are interested in a personality profile of a CEO or a company profile of just, this is my company and here's what it does, and do you want to write about us, right? Like that's not going to be very compelling. So that's where it becomes really important to tie it back to the so what, right? Like it's not just like, this is my company and we make animal feed. It's, this is my company and we make animal feed in a way that is sustainable and, is going to be the way of the future moving forward, is indicative of how our industry is shifting to meet these challenges, right? Is things like whatever it is that makes your work important, right? That's the story that you want to tell. And I think, you asked about thought leadership, which is something that a way that you use communications to get your executives out there in the world. And the reason that you do that is not just to stroke the egos of your executives, but because there's an intersection between something that your executive is very passionate about and something that is also very important to your company, right? So whether that is, in the industry, whether it is along the lines of a core value, let's say that one of your core values at your company is
sustainability.
Sustainability, sure.
Okay.
And then you also have an executive who is very passionate about sustainability and who is a member of various nonprofit groups dedicated to that, and is, part of councils that are leading in research on that, or even just really likes to read some of the key publications on that topic, and knows what articles are good, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can even then share those on LinkedIn. That's how I will kind of advise people to, if you're interested in building a thought leadership campaign, you have to find something that the executive is really passionate about already, and that then intersects with something that's important to the company. And I always think it's best to do this with an executive who has a bent towards thought leadership, right? If you have an executive who has never had a LinkedIn channel or has never been on social media, don't try to force them to be suddenly like your social media guru. It's going to be so much work for you, right? Like it's so much better if you can find people who kind of already have a bent in a certain direction in communications. And then what you're doing is you're really just amplifying them. You're giving them ideas for content, right? So someone was asking me about this the other day, someone not in the biotech industry. He was a financial consultant, and he was asking me, he was saying, I kind of want to become, an influencer in financial consulting, but man, like making these videos is so time consuming. Like, I just don't know, like, can I make a video every week for like, how often do you think I need to be posting on LinkedIn? And if it's like weekly, I just making these videos and editing them and stuff and put it, it's just so time consuming. And I had said to him, okay, so think about this, right? Think about maybe you only do a video once every other month, because there's other content that you can be filling in, right? Maybe some weeks you're finding a really great article, whether it's in the Harvard Business Review or it's, whatever applicable case studies, some really great article from the New York Times that's just so on point with, why financial planning is important, or, some tricks to financial planning or inside tips that you really agree with, that you think are great. You can just share that on your LinkedIn. That's a very, very low time investment way of putting out content that is really going to be valuable to your followers, that your follower base that you're trying to build, right? Another thing you can do is look for, maybe you share an article once a month, and then maybe once a month you're looking for some kind of a meme, right? Some kind of a visual that has a quote or a cartoon or something that is really, again, just like gets to the heart of what you like. And maybe you can create that yourself, or maybe you can find it from someone else and share it. Just make sure to always give credit where credit is due. That's very important in the social media world. So maybe you're doing that once a week, right? And maybe once a week you could do audio only if that's easier for you than a video. And then, you're doing your video and suddenly you've got a month's worth of content there, right? A lot more is, so it's just, that was kind of how I was advising him, at least to approach that and think through building a thought leadership campaign.
So two things jump out at me with that answer. The first part about the pitching journalist, if I could change the word journalist to prospect, you just described the difference between great salespeople and mediocre salespeople. The mediocre ones say, oh, this is my company, this is what we do, this is why you ought to think we're important. The great salespeople understand the prospect's problems, and they research them, and they speak to it, and they find those points of intersection between the prospect's problems, the prospect's initiatives and priorities, and what they do. So, I mean, really, you just talked about communications people as being great salespeople, the way you described it. The second thing,
absolutely. I mean, it's all a relationship business, right? I mean, it all comes down to relationships. So absolutely, I think I see a lot of parallels there.
The second thing that you mentioned is the power of LinkedIn and potentially some other social media for thought leadership. It's easy. I'm thinking communications. I'm thinking PR. I'm thinking get your people in front of journalists, but people can put themselves out there in the world as well and establish their authority and their expertise and their particular insights by doing exactly what you talked about. Would you suggest that a communications team create some content for the executive, or do you just feed ideas, and do you think it's important the executive be speaking authentically in their own voice?
I think you can do both. I think it depends, right? Like, I think if you have a communications team that you keep very close and that has the information that they need to be successful and to understand what's going on in your mind, then they can often create content for you, right? And that's a lot of what I do at the, the CEO level. I have had multiple CEOs call me their whisperer over the years, right? Because they will be pacing their office and they will be brainstorming about their vision and what they want to do with the company. And maybe they're scribbling things on the whiteboard, right? They're being very creative. They're thinking very big picture. And I will sit there and listen to them. And then I will turn that into the slide deck that we need to present to our board of directors. And then they will look at the slide deck and they will say, that's exactly what I meant. Like, that's what I meant to say. Oh, right. That's just it, right? So like that, I think if you have good communications people and you have a good relationship with them and you give them enough information to be successful, then they can do that legwork for you, right? I think what you want to be careful of is you have to maintain that authenticity, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I can't be making up the strategy. Right. And for our board of directors, it has to be our CEO's strategy, right? So it's gotta, like, what I have to be doing as a communicator is putting his thoughts into a slide deck, right? Mm-hmm. Not inserting my own thoughts. Right. And so that's like where you have to be careful and you have to really work together to keep that authenticity.
Makes sense. Back to the question of strategy versus execution. One of my pet peeves is people who conflate the two. There's so much discussion of strategy when people are talking about tactical stuff. How do you kind of, what's the right way to say it? Do you have some rule of thumb where you're able to remind people when they start drifting into tactics and calling it strategy and bring them back to whichever is appropriate for the conversation?
I don't know that there's any magic bullet on that. I mean, I think, oftentimes I do a lot of this in when I'm facilitating our leadership team meetings or facilitating our board meetings, right? Every situation is different. Sometimes the tactical discussion can be important. Sometimes you have to let it roll a little bit. Other times you have to know, okay, we're going way down a rabbit hole here and we need to bring it back. And so then, you'll have to say, I'm going to suggest that we take this offline. I'm going to suggest that we parking lot this and come back to it. I'm going to suggest that you have a follow-up meeting and work through this and bring it back to the group, right? Like, there's a lot of different ways I think you can try to transition it back to the big picture, right? Keep people on track.
And obviously you spend a lot of time with that facilitation sort of work. Is that because of your skill set, your personality, or is that in many cases a function of the communications role in a company?
It's probably a little bit of both. I think that when communications is used well in a company, it does have a strategic seat at the table. And I do think that communicators are often skilled at doing that sort of work, that facilitation work, right? Because they tend to be good listeners. They tend to be able to follow the thread of the conversation and see when it's creating value, when it's getting off track. So I guess I would say it's probably a little of both. I mean, that's also just something that I enjoy. But I think that if, I often say, I think communications, I think HR has had a similar kind of issue as far as like, you people see HR as like, oh, well, they just do the benefits and hire people. And people see communications as like, well, they just write the press releases or whatever, and I think that both of those functions, if you have the right person and, the right needs at the table, can really add a lot of strategic value beyond that. And, one example that I often, give to CEOs is, I don't know if you like to read like, detective novels, but like, when you get to the aha at the end, you're like, oh my gosh, of course, I can't believe I didn't see that coming. And you're not going to get that reaction if you don't leave clues early on, right? So I'll often say, don't call me at chapter 35 and say, write a press release, we need it to go out tomorrow, right? I want to be partnering with you at chapter 2. and thinking all the way along so that we're leaving these breadcrumbs, so that we're setting up the trail, right? Because then eventually when the press release comes, you want that reaction from your community, from your investors, from your analysts, from your employees to be like, oh, well, that makes perfect strategic sense. Like, of course they would acquire that product. Of course they would enter this segment. Of course they would launch this new thing, right? That makes perfect sense. Fits their strategy, right? But you're not going to get that if people don't understand your strategy and they're not kind of following you as you're building it.
And back to this point that you've consistently woven through this conversation, it can't be on an ad hoc basis. It has to be very deliberately working from the strategy, and the strategy has to be properly conceived in order for the whole thing to fit together.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned the NACD and others use it as well in the board community, this expression of nose in, fingers out. What would you recommend as the kinds of questions that knowledgeable directors might ask of executive management to gauge their understanding of how communications ought to be incorporated into really good, proper corporate function?
Oh, I think my number one question would be, when you look at their communications, do you understand how it is supporting the corporate goals, right? And the corporate strategy? Because that's number one. That's what it should be doing. If your communications is not helping you achieve your business goals, then it's just vanity press and it's not really going to do anybody any good, right? You really want to make sure that the things that you're investing in are going to actually help you achieve those goals. So that, I think that would be my number one line of questioning, would be trying to make sure that I can see that connection.
Vanity press. I love that expression. Do you have any rule of thumb of what size a typical company might be when it's appropriate for them to think about breaking strategic communications out as a distinct function?
That's a really good question. And I don't know that there's a magic answer for that. I mean, I will tell you that at one of the companies that I worked at, so we had, let's say, 20 scientists, and the CEO was a founding scientist. And there was one person who was kind of HR/finance/office manager, right? That was the company was set up. And the board decided that they wanted this company to, that some of the stuff the scientists had been cranking out was pretty good, and it was time to take it to the next level. And they wanted to see a U.S. affiliate built, and they wanted to see this company start to work with the U.S. FDA and start to follow a path that could eventually lead to like real clinical trials that meet the very high standards of the U.S. FDA. And so they hired a new CEO, the former CEO, the founding CEO. He became the chief scientific officer. They hired a new CEO who had more of a business background, right? He hired a CFO and myself, and we started on the same day. And that was the beginnings of our leadership team. And then a few months later, he hired a head of HR, and we kind of built from there. But it was very, very early. Now, this CEO I had the pleasure of working with before, so he knew what I could do, and I was very flattered that he said, I want you by my side from the very beginning as we built this. And so but I think that can work if you are a leader who has experienced and understands the value of really strategic and really good communications. And also in my current role, right, I'm leading corporate affairs, and I'm also chief of staff to the CEO, because there's a lot of overlap. There can be a lot of overlap there, right? Because in the chief of staff role, I'm doing, a lot of this board work and board communications, leadership team work, keeping the leadership team functioning as well as possible and communicating as well as possible. And I mean, I can't, in certain times, you'll find yourself using Communication skills, I think almost the way that you would in your personal life too, right? Like communication skills is important all across the map. Sometimes
Sure.
at companies I'll have, one leadership team member coming to me complaining about another leadership team member, and I'll have to remind them. I'll say, have you talked to that person directly? Have you let them know that that's bothering you?
Right.
That's probably where we should start, right? So it's sort of like, I feel like I'm talking to my kids sometimes, right? Like it's like the same kind of communications is you'd be amazed at how broadly applicable I think communication skills can be. So I guess, for a smaller company, if you could see having someone doing strategic communications with you, and yet you're not sure if you want to invest in that as a full-time employee, you could think about, could they lead communications and strategy? Could they lead communications and marketing and be my chief of staff, or operations? Or, is there a way, are there skill sets that are complementary that you could bundle until you get to until you get to a point where you really feel like you need it? I will also say there are a lot of very senior, very good communications consultants out there. So, you can also tap into someone like that if you're not ready to hire that internally.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, because for a typical industrial company, let's say they're $200 or $300 million, they probably have a sales team of about 50 people. They typically have a marketing team of maybe 2 or 3. And so the idea of adding a dedicated communications person may be unpalatable until they understand the benefit of it, kind of from seeing it work. So I know you started as a consultant, or rather you started as an agency, and then you've been a consultant through your career. If somebody's not ready to hire internally, you mentioned those potential consultants, but should they consider a PR agency or a fractional person or a marketing agency? How do those fit in together?
Any of them can be a good option. I think it really depends on what you need. I think if you have a marketing team already, and your marketing team could probably write press releases and do some of the corporate communications work, some of that content creation work, but they just need someone with more communication skill set, more strategic guidance, then maybe a senior level consultant would be, a really good choice to kind of partner with them, because marketing and communications, there are overlapping skills, as we talked about, but it's not a perfect match, right? The big difference between product communications and corporate communications that I've seen is that product communications tends to be very stable and predictable, right?
Okay.
You come in the fall, you're brand planning for the year ahead, you put your plan together, and then you just march down the field and you execute it all year long, right? Corporate communications is sort of where anything can happen, right? You don't know what you're going to walk into day to day. If you're going to walk into a merger, or an acquisition, or a financing need, or a activist investor causing you trouble, or your share price fluctuating, or an executive having a scandal, or deciding to retire, or whatever it is, right? Like it's always changing, and so you have to have like a lot of agility to be able to do corporate communications. I've sometimes seen kind of people who grow up in the marketing and the product world struggle a little bit in the transition to more of a corporate communications, because you do have to be kind of ready for anything, any day. You have to be able to have that agility. I personally like it better. I have done product communications, but I have focused most of my career more on the corporate side and the investor relations side, because I like the pace of it. So, but I think, sorry, to get back to your question, right? So that's why I would say the skill sets are not completely transferable, and you would want to have a senior person providing direction and strategy. I think if you are at a stage where you need a senior thought partner, but you also need arms and legs to execute and get things done, then you might want to consider an agency, because, the way that consulting and agencies work is the billing rate, the hourly rate that they're going to charge you, increases with how senior the person is. So if you need both very senior strategic advice and you need more junior advice, you're going to probably want agency so that you're not paying the same rate for both of those things.
Let's talk about a topic I know that seems to be on the top of everyone's list these days, AI. And looking at it from the perspective of your communications world, what's your sense? What's the impact of AI going to be on communications?
So I think that depends on the industry in which you work. I think that probably in some industries, there may be potential for AI to cut down on a lot of the, first drafting of materials that you have to do. In the pharmaceutical industry, intellectual property is paramount. And so confidentiality is paramount. And so we don't currently I don't currently use AI because of the sensitivities of the industry in which I work. But I think it will be dependent on those types of limitations, and I'm sure we'll see the impact in the future.
Got it. You mentioned earlier that communications can certainly help with other audiences. One of them is potentially talent. And in the world of manufacturing, the industrial world, talent has been a big problem for, certainly through the pandemic, and it kind of continues to be an issue. How do you craft communications? Obviously you're going to say different things depending on the industry and the geographical region and all the other kinds of factors involved, but how do you think of using communications as a tool to help recruit and retain people?
Ed, you're exactly right about that. I mean, I think it all depends on your audience. So, it starts with who are you trying to reach and go where they are, right? Like, so for example, in an industry like the industry that I work in, where we are trying to hire a lot of scientists, most of them are on LinkedIn, so we can reach them that way. Some of them use very science-specific job boards. So, we may purchase contracts to post our jobs in some of those outlets. I think, when you think about who you're trying to recruit, think about where are they reading their news? Mm-hmm. And that's, if they're reading the local, city newspaper or the local community or town newspaper, that might be where you want to be. If they're listening to the radio while they're working during the day, the local radio, that may be where you want to be, right? I think it depends on if they're on LinkedIn, that's where you want to be. So I think it depends. You definitely want to go where they are.
So that's the part about kind of the best channel to reach them. But obviously you spoke before at length about the importance of telling a story. Tell the story that's going to engage them, get them excited, want them to be part of the team, want them to remain part of the team. Is that something that you find are HR departments and communications working together consciously in many cases to craft that story, or does it just happen by accident?
No, I mean, I think absolutely you want to craft that story, right? And you want to help people see the value that you're bringing to the world and why the work is important. You also want to help them see what your culture is like. When I think about doing communications to attract employees, I think about it as a window. You want to give them a window into what it's like to work at your company, and then they can determine if that's going to be a good fit. Right. So you want to show them what you guys do to bring your core values to life, how you live your values, show them how you get together in the workplace and celebrate milestone achievements, show them the work that you're doing and how it's actually impacting the community or impacting the customer base. Show them your financial stability and success. That honestly, in the wake of the pandemic, I don't know how it is in the industrial manufacturing industry, but in biotech, it's been very difficult. There have been a lot of companies who have run out of funding and have had to lay off employees. So financial stability is a very important message for potential employees. They really don't want to go work for a company that has less than 2 years of cash runway in most cases.
Yeah, that window is a great metaphor. I hadn't thought of it that way, but what a wonderful way to explain to somebody what they're trying to do for potential employees to lay that out that way.
It's similar. I was just going to say, I mean, it really, transparency is the way to go,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if you try to portray your company as something that it's not, you're not going to be doing yourself any favors,
Right.
because when they get in the door, they're going to see what it's like, and then they're not going to stay. So,
Right.
I think, I really think the same principle fits with investor relations, right? Like when you're doing investor relations, your job is not to try to quote unquote sell the stock, right? Your job is to accurately and transparently communicate, here are the potential upsides and here are the potential risks, right? You want people to understand both, and then the investor can make an informed decision as to whether or not this stock is a good investment for their portfolio.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. What resources do you recommend for people if they don't know the comms world, if they're not, kind of steeped in it the way you are with the background you have, but want to learn about it? Are there YouTube channels or podcasts or blogs or books that you recommend folks turn to?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I will say there's an organization called PRSA, which is the Public Relations Society of America. They have been around for a very, very long time and provide a lot of good introductory information. Similarly, on the investor relations front, there is a group called NIRI, NIRI. I believe it's the National Investor Relations Institute, although I might have that acronym wrong, but it's definitely NIRI, and they similarly can provide a lot of foundational materials on the investor relations front.
And from a tactical perspective, best practices, tips, that kind of thing, are there folks that you would recommend that people might tune into?
I think it really depends. I mean, you mentioned that you had heard my interview on the Frictionless Marketing podcast. I love that podcast. I listen to it all the time. I do think it's it gets a bit in the weeds. So if you're not living and breathing communications, you might not find it as helpful from, say, like an entry level. But I do think, at the entry level, there are also a lot of seminars, courses, introductions to communications through, local universities that can provide a good grounding. And like I said, I mean, I have, guest lectured at some of those courses as well, both for, undergraduate students and also for, graduate students who are, really pursuing this. And I think there's a lot of education to be had out there.
Makes sense. You mentioned confidentiality, I think, in the context of AI and biotech, where your information is very close hold. Many of the traditional industrial manufacturers tend to be very private. They're privately owned. They treat their IP very seriously. They're very careful about sharing information. So it feels like there may be some concern. On the one hand, we're talking about communications to tell the world about what we do. On the other hand, they want to keep a lot of it private. Do you have tips on how to try to reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it comes back to the corporate goals, because, I'm not here to tell you that every company should be doing a robust, multi-channel communications program.
Mm-hmm.
I'm only telling you to do that if it's the right fit for your company, right? So and if it can really help you achieve your goals,
Right.
whether your corporate goal is to hire new employees, whether it's to better reach your existing employees and get them better aligned, whether it's to influence investors, whether it's to reach customers and create loyalty to your brand amongst your customer base, right? Whatever, maybe it's to influence regulators. I know that's something that in my industry, certainly we always have to be aware of. I work in a very heavily regulated industry. I would imagine that many of your customers do as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, I really think it's about thinking about the type of communications that you can do to reach those audiences and actually achieve those goals. And then if you think, okay, this could really help us, then you can think about, how do I tell the story in a way that gets the key points across and doesn't overshare, right? Because you do always have to be aware your competitors are out there listening, right? You do always need to be aware of that. So I think it's a good question to ask. It's the right question to ask. Leaders should push on, when does the benefit outweigh the risk
Right.
of communicating, and when does the risk outweigh the benefit?
That sounds sensible. What's your biggest concern about business in general over the course of the next few years from your communications perspective?
Wow, that's a very broad and open-ended question. I think I'm going to answer this a little bit from my perspective
Good.
of working in the pharmaceutical industry, which is, I don't think that companies have always made the best and most ethical choices. I do think that in the pharmaceutical industry, right, where I work, the majority of the people who are scientists and who work in the line level of these companies, and even honestly who work in the management of these companies as I do, really truly want to help people. And that's why they get out of bed every day. But unfortunately, I think a minority of actors who perhaps make unethical decisions end up getting a majority of headlines, and it creates a real reputational risk. So for example, the the pharmaceutical industry is under a lot of pressure over pricing right now, which personally I kind of think is the wrong question. I think the right question is not necessarily why is the drug priced this way, but why is the patient responsible for any of it? Like the whole concept of copays, of patients having to have skin in the game, is just really hard for me to wrap my head around, because like you're not bargain shopping for chemotherapy, right? Like for fun. It's not like a choice that you want to make. It just the incentives I feel like are just so misaligned, and but we haven't done a good job communicating that. And fighting for that. And so, people think pharmaceutical companies, they think, bad people, high prices, unethical behavior. And some of that has been warranted by bad decisions that, like I said, have been made by a minority of players. But, I think that across all industries, people really expect you to communicate transparently. They expect you to be authentic. They expect you to be honest. They expect you to be straightforward. I think that the bar has risen for that. And I think that companies that don't do that, the speed with which you can get blowback and get called out on social media, is frightening.
Yeah, it is.
So I think that I think it'll be really important for companies to start to view communications. I think in the past, people, they kind of viewed communications almost as the same as like advertising. It's just about buying some space and putting a message out there. And I don't think that's what customers want. I mean, if you look at, from your audience's perspective, look at brands that where the company, the corporate brand is consistently ranked, really, really high. Brands like maybe Patagonia, they make decisions and they spend their money on things that matter to their customer base, right? Which is sustainability. They actually did a really interesting advertising campaign, which was buy less, expect more, right? Which isn't what you expect someone who's selling clothing to say, buy less clothing. But of course, what they were trying to set up was the fact that like fast fashion is ruining the environment, right? And so you want to try to buy less clothing, but clothing that will last, which of course fits into their product profile and what they're trying to sell, right? But I think, people, they expect more from corporations today. They expect you to be responsible and to be transparent and to be thinking about not only, your bottom line. Of course, you absolutely have a fiduciary duty to your investors, but they expect you to be thinking about a lot of other things too, and how you're being a responsible member of the community.
Yeah, and I think that you talked about unethical decisions. A lot of times, I don't think it's even unethical. It's just convenient. The convenient decision isn't necessarily the right decision. And in terms of people's sensitivities, it seems to me that the awareness and resistance to spin is definitely increasing. People sense if you're just telling a story. I mean, your call is really important to us. How many times have we heard that? Even something as simple as that. So that's great feedback about the problems that you see. Let's flip that around. How about the biggest opportunity for communications? Is it simply to be transparent and to address these concerns, or is there something deeper there?
Well, I think it's that it comes back to that authenticity, right? I mean, you're absolutely right. The thing that is the biggest risk, the flip side of it, is going to be what is the greatest benefit, right?
Right.
And I do think there's a real opportunity for companies to get out there and to communicate authentically and transparently and really build a relationship with their customer base. And I think that when you listen to your customers and you listen to what they want, right? Like that can lead you into whole new areas of growth that maybe you didn't even expect. So, I think, and I think, like, for example, there was a time in the pharmaceutical industry where, the customer was only considered to be the doctor, and the patient was considered to be fairly irrelevant to the equation, honestly. And I think over the last, that was a while ago. I think over the last 10 years or so, the industry has really shifted and has really started to listen to patients, and it makes a difference. I mean, one of my favorite cartoons is this doctor saying to the patient, "Please don't mistake your Google search for my 4 years of medical study and my degree." And the patient says back, "Please don't mistake your 4 years of medical school for my 20 years of living with this condition."
Yeah. Wow.
It's very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we can change the, plug in different words, do a Mad Lib, if you will, change patient to end user for an industrial manufacturer. And although the implications in terms of life and death and health may not be as dire in the short term, the lesson, I think, is absolutely the same.
That's what I love about communications. I think the principles are so broadly applicable.
Right.
We talked about this a little bit earlier, but the skills that you use when you start to pay attention to communications, you will use these skills across your professional life, across your personal life, right? At this job, at the next job,
Right.
in the transition process, with your kids, with your partner or your spouse. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I think communications it's a great set of skills to have.
All right. So with that, having listened to this, I'm sure there's going to be people who not only want to follow you and connect with you, but also may have in mind, geez, we hadn't thought about the importance of communications on our board. And maybe they're thinking about adding an independent director, or they need to fill a seat of somebody that's termed off. So if they want to be in touch with you, if they want to understand your kind of perspective as a potential board member, follow you for insights into communications, what is the best way for them to be in touch with you?
I would urge anyone to feel free to reach out to me through LinkedIn. That is probably the best way to get a hold of me. So just reach out, send me a message on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect and talk further about this topic. As you can tell, it's a topic that I'm very passionate about, so I'm always happy to talk about it.
Terrific. All right, let's kind of wrap it up. We've bounced around tactical, strategic, we've talked communications, we've talked marketing, we've talked content, we've talked all kinds of different stuff. So put a bow around it all for us, if you would, with some final meta level explanation of why companies really need to think about including communications as a critical function in the way they go to market.
Ed, just set the bar high there. You want me to wrap the whole thing up in a bow, right?
Yeah.
I think I'm going to come back to what I said at the very, very beginning, which is that communications is the forcing function for strategy. And so if you want to make sure that you're setting a strong strategy for your company, and you want to make sure that your audiences understand that strategy and that you can reach those corporate goals that you have set for your company, whether it's, selling X number of things to consumers in a B2B, area, whether it's hiring, whether it's investors, attracting investors, whatever your corporate goals are. I think communications can often help you get there. And so I think it's really just a critical thing to think about.
Well, you say I set the bar high, but you cleared the bar by far with a perfect synopsis of what we had talked about. I've learned so much. I was excited about this conversation because it's a topic that I sensed was important from talking to you and listening to you, but I didn't understand nearly as much as you've made so clear during this conversation. So thank you very, very much. Thank you for your insights. Thanks for your ideas. Thanks for your patience and generosity in sharing your time with me and with the audience.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I love the potential here to bring some of my communications knowledge and skill set to a new industry. So very, very excited to get those messages out there and help people appreciate the value of communications.
Perfect. It's been a pleasure. For anyone listening or watching, again, please remember, I'd be grateful if you'd be willing to like and share and review and comment. Pass this episode along to somebody in your network who you think would really benefit from this deep dive into communications and perhaps getting to know Trista and maybe even reaching out to her for some of the expertise that she brings. Thanks very much for everybody for listening.